Spiritual seduction, it's a form of persuasion which attempts to lure people into the spiritual adultery of idolatry. And this is happening through the enticing yet empty promises of religious deception. It was this sort of spiritual seduction that Peter was describing in his second epistle when he warned us about those religious deceivers who will allure people with great swelling words of emptiness. Peter also tells us that they'll promise to provide us with freedom and liberty, all the while they themselves are still slaves of corruption. As we consider Peter's concerns, it's sad to say that the world is actually filled with religious leaders who have absolutely no problem luring people into the adultery of idolatry through the empty promises of spiritual seduction. One example of this can be seen in the promises of the televangelists who get on television and assure us that those who will simply support their ministry with financial offerings will enjoy perfect health and unlimited wealth. It's sad to say that these spiritual charlatans, they're living in lavish luxury simply because there are so many people who allow themselves to be enticed by the lies of those deceivers. Another example of spiritual seduction can be seen in the promises that are made by those religious leaders who assure us of eternal glory so long as we're willing to obey all of their religious rules and rituals. As a result, there's no problem convincing Jehovah's Witnesses to canvass your neighborhood, and in the same sense, it's not hard to convince Muslims that they need to pray 5 times a day. They've been duped, they've been seduced with spiritual lies, and therefore they're engaging in all of these religious works. Without debate, the world is filled with false religions, all of which attempt to allure new adherents with empty promises. And after spending many, many hours of my own life examining the theological beliefs of the world's religions, I must insist that the worst forms of spiritual seduction are found in those religious systems which attempt to convince us that they are the one and only true Christian church. You see, the Christian church is, as you know, the bride of Christ. And as such, we've been called to behave like a chaste virgin who has been betrothed to the Lord Jesus. Conversely, the idolatrous religions which claim to be the Christian church, well, they're nothing more than horrible harlots. And as such, they're harlots who are engaging in the worst brand of spiritual seduction by attempting to present themselves as being the true bride of Christ. Here in our study today, we're going to consider the spiritual seduction of the harlot who is riding the beast in Revelation chapter 17. And as we make our way through our text today, we're going to see that the harlot who is seated upon this beast is an immoral idolatress who is leading the world into religious syncretism. Secondly, this morning, we'll see that this immoral idolatress is leading the world into economic globalism. Thirdly and finally today, we'll see that the immoral idolatress is leading the world into political imperialism. Well, with this as our outline, let's open our Bibles to Revelation chapter 17, because here we find an angel helping John to grasp the great influence of this immoral idolatress. As you make your way to Revelation 17, I want to continue setting the stage for our text today by taking a moment to remind you that I've already identified this spiritual harlot throughout our last 2 studies. But before we examine the immoral influence that this idolatress has upon the world, I want to take a moment to place our text back into its context so that we can consider what we've learned so far. With this as our goal, let's begin by taking a moment to recap the clues that the angel presented to the Apostle John, which helps us to identify this femme fatale. The first clue that we find here in Revelation 17 is found at the end of verse 2. There we learn that this spiritual seductress sits on many waters, and she is the harlot with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication. And then there in the second half of verse 2, we learn that the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So we see then that this immoral idolatress is a religious organization which has worldwide influence over kings and over commoners alike. The second clue that we considered is found there in verse 4, where John tells us that the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. Or, in other words, this great harlot is a religious organization which has great wealth. Not only that, but the leaders of this world religion are easily identified because they're going to be draped in purple and in scarlet robes. Without debate, this drastically narrows down the options before us. The third clue that we're presented with is found there in the second half of verse 4, where John describes this religious system as the great harlot who is holding a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. And so we see then that this religious system is not only identified by her worldly power and wealth, but this is also a world religion which has leaders who wear purple and scarlet robes and hold a golden cup which is used for their religious services. And while this probably is enough to identify this immoral idolatress, we still have a few more clues to consider. The fourth clue here helps us to see that this religious system finds its roots in the mystery religion of ancient Babylon, which I'll remind you is based on the worship of Nimrod's wife, Semiramis, and her son, Tammuz. With this in mind, look with me again there at verse 5. There we learn that the harlot is called Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. Now, in light of this, we can see that this spiritual seductress is a mystery religion which finds its roots in the theological lies which were introduced back in ancient Babylon when Nimrod's wife Semiramis attempted to convince the world that she was the virgin who brought forth the promised child Tammuz. The fifth clue that we're given now is presented in verse 6. Here we learn that the woman is drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. Here in this verse, we learn that this immoral idolatress is a world religion which is guilty of murdering the true saints of the Lord Jesus Christ. And while it's true that the leaders of this religion will have the appearance of godliness, it's also true that they're going to be drunk with power as they set out to silence the true saints. The sixth clue, which will help us to identify this immoral idolatress, is found there in verse 9, where the angel declares, "Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits." Now, there are several cities all throughout the world which have been built upon 7 hills. But as we factor in the religious aspects of this clue, it's interesting to note that the Muslim city of Mecca is surrounded by 7 hills. Not only that, but the city of Jerusalem is also built upon 7 hills. Finally, I'll remind you that the Vatican State of Rome is called the city of 7 hills. That's one thing they call themselves. But as we add up all these clues together, as we take them all into account, it seems clear to me that the city with 7 hills is none other than the Vatican State of Rome. Think about it. The Roman Catholic Church is the wealthiest religion in the world, which has leaders who wear scarlet and purple robes. Not only that, but the Roman Catholic Church has also perpetuated the mother-son mystery religion of ancient Babylon. Furthermore, the Roman Catholic Church leads its people to bow before a golden cup at every Mass. And as I pointed out 2 weeks ago, the Roman Catholic Church has been drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus Christ, which you can see all throughout the Middle Ages. Now, this brings us up to speed, and with all these clues in mind, I want to consider how the Roman Catholic Church is in fact the immoral idolatress who will continue to use her influence in order to control the kings of the earth. And not only that, but she will also continue to cause the inhabitants of the earth to suffer from spiritual intoxication through the wine of her religious fornication. In order to prove my point, let's continue to make our way through Revelation chapter 17. Let's pick up our study here, beginning at verse 15. Here John declares, "Then he said to me, the waters which you saw, where the harlot sits, are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. And the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot, make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to fulfill his purpose, to be of one mind, and to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman whom you saw is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth." Now, here in the final verses of this chapter, we find this unnamed angel. He's presenting the Apostle John with a prophetic picture of the way in which the harlot will continue to make an impact upon this world. And the first thing that we should consider and recognize is that this spiritual seductress who is seated upon the waters is a religious system which has influence over peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues all over the world. And there should be no doubt that this is a description of the influence that the Roman Catholic Church currently has on the world in which we live. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, the number of Roman Catholics in the world is nearly 1.1 billion. That's right, there are about 1.1 billion Roman Catholics in the world, which is greater than nearly all other religious traditions. For example, there are more Roman Catholics than all Buddhists or all Hindus. And while it's true that there are more Muslims than Roman Catholics, it's also true that the number of Roman Catholics is greater than that of the individual Muslim traditions, which are Shia and Sunni. In light of this, you better believe that the Roman Catholic Church has major influence over the multitudes of the people who are here on the planet. And it's sad to say that there was a day when the leaders of the Holy See, they were using their influence to forcibly convert people to the Roman Catholic faith, or they would suffer the consequences. For example, it was back in the 8th century during the Frankish kingdom of Charlemagne when the Saxons were forced to convert to Roman Catholicism, and they were forced at the tip of the sword. And while it's true that there were some who opposed this practice, it's also true that forced conversions throughout the Middle Ages continued to increase in popularity as Catholic leaders set out to conquer the world, all in the name of Christ. And listen, the forced conversions conducted by the leaders of the Roman Catholic Church not only impacted medieval Europe, but we also see the same tactics being used all throughout Africa, Israel, and South America. As a matter of fact, consider this statement made by a prominent historian. His name is Luis Felipe de Alencastro. He described the spread of Roman Catholicism in South America by declaring this. He says, "The missionaries were at the service of a religion that had incorporated the authoritarian and despotic elements of European monarchy." In other words, they were out forcing people to become Roman Catholics there in South America. Pope Benedict XVI even confessed that unjustifiable crimes were committed in the conquest of South America. That's what he calls it, the conquest of South America. Very sad. Without debate, those religious leaders who either endorsed or engaged in the forced conversion of unbelievers, they failed to understand what Jesus meant when he described the kingdom of God to a Roman prefect named Pilate. He said this to Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." Christian, listen, the church hasn't been called to establish an earthly kingdom for Christ at the tip of the sword. We haven't been called to go out and forcibly convert people to the Christian faith. You can't even do that. Someone who's forced to convert to Christianity really hasn't become a Christian. They've just attempted to avoid being killed, and that's it. You can't forcibly convert a person to the Christian faith. No one said it's a faith-based decision that every person must freely make. And yet, the Roman Catholic Church in the medieval ages, they didn't recognize this. Thankfully, the only forced conversions that the Catholic Church is engaging in today occurs at their infant baptisms, where babies are forced to become Roman Catholics. And yet at the same time, we must understand that the leaders of the Holy See have continued to engage in the religious lie of syncretism. For the sake of clarity, it'll help you know that the word syncretism, it refers to the attempted reconciliation or union of different or opposing principles, practices, or parties. And as we consider this word in a religious context, it'll help you to know that syncretism is used in reference to those who blend the beliefs of two or more religious systems so that all parties involved can worship together. For example, it was during the 4th century when Emperor Constantine was allegedly converted to the Christian faith. There is some debate about whether he truly became a Christian or not. I really couldn't tell you. I hope to see him in heaven, but we don't know right now. I can't tell you if Constantine truly became a born-again believer, but what I do know is that he was a political leader who attempted to establish what's called Pax Romana, or in other words, the peace of Rome, by spiritually syncretizing every religious system within the Roman Empire so that all people of all faiths could worship together. And so you see this combination of the holy days of the pagans and the holy days of Christians combining together so that they could all celebrate their own faiths on the same days. As a result, the Christian faith began to be blended together with the pagan beliefs so that the religious unity of Rome could be realized. And that's where you start seeing this blending of the Roman Catholic belief in the mother-son deities that go back to ancient Babylon with the worship of Jesus and his mother Mary. Another example of this can be seen in the spread of Catholicism down in South America. You might not know this, but the indigenous Indians of South America, they practiced a various form of animism. They all had their own different animistic beliefs. And just for the sake of clarity, animism is based on the belief that inanimate objects like plants and rocks and idols all possess distinct spiritual essence. They can be possessed by spirits and animated by spirits. And so when these people in South America were forced to convert to Christianity, they were also allowed to practice their animism within the context of Christian terminology, so that they ended up praying to statues of saints and statues of angels and statues of Mary. This is where you find all of this animistic Catholicism in South America. It's a blending or a syncretizing of South American animism and Roman Catholicism. And it's accepted. It's allowed to be practiced there in South America. Pope John Paul II even confessed that those who practice animism are particularly close to Christianity. No, they're not. There is nothing animistic about Christianity, not true Christianity, and yet the Pope allows for it because it happened through this syncretism. And not only did Pope John Paul II engage in spiritual syncretism by comparing the pagan practice of animism to Catholicism, but he also went on to host a World Day of Prayer for Peace in the Italian city of Assisi on October the 26th, 1986. This syncretistic meeting allowed Muslims and Jews, Zoroastrians and Native Americans and more to spend time praying together, which he treated as we're all praying to the same God. No, we're not. All these different faiths aren't praying to the same God. Well, you would think that the Pope would realize that this sort of syncretism is nothing more than a rejection of the God of the Bible, and yet instead he continued to lead the world into spiritual syncretism by hosting this prayer meeting on two more occasions, once in 1993 and then again in 2002. And listen, this standard of spiritual syncretism which was demonstrated by Pope John Paul II, can also be seen in the leadership of Pope Benedict XVI, who hosted the same prayer meeting back in 2011. It was last September also when Pope Francis hosted the same interfaith prayer meeting right there in Assisi. According to one report, this three-day gathering was attended by more than 500 religious leaders from 9 different religions, including Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, several Christian denominations, and yes, even atheists. Clearly, the current pope has no problem engaging in the same syncretism as his predecessors. In order to further make my point, hold your place here in the book of Revelation and turn with me to Matthew chapter 23. As you make your way to Matthew 23, I want to direct your attention to a message that Pope Francis presented back in March of 2016. He was speaking to some 200 representatives from different religions. 200 representatives from different religions. And he tells these leaders from different religions this. He says, religions are called to be messengers of peace and builders of communion, and to proclaim in opposition to all those who sow conflict, division, and intolerance that ours is a time of fraternity. In other words, a religion is supposed to come together in peace. We're supposed to just accept one another. Not only that, but he concluded this same message to the same group by declaring this. He says, may the religions be wombs of life, bearing the merciful love of God to a wounded and needy humanity. May they be doors of hope, helping to penetrate the walls erected by pride and fear. Now, here we find Pope Francis saying that religions are wombs of life. They're doors of hope. And yet consider his message in light of what Jesus says here in Matthew 23. We'll begin reading at verse 13. Here Jesus, speaking to the religious leaders of Israel, he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, for you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you travel land and sea to win one proselyte, and when he is won, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves." Wow. Incredible. Jesus wasn't describing the religious leaders of Israel as messengers of peace. He wasn't describing them as builders of communion. No, instead he called them hypocrites. And he referred to them as sons of hell. And rather than referring to their religious system of Judaism as a womb of life and a door of hope, he told those religious leaders that their religion was shutting the door to the kingdom, thereby keeping men from entering in. In light of this, I can assure you that the message of Pope Francis is failing to properly represent the one he claims to be here in place of. Rather than rebuking the leaders of those false religious systems, rather than standing before those 200 world leaders of 9 different religions and saying, your religion is not a womb of life, but rather is leading people to hell. He didn't say that. No, he says your religions are wombs of life and so on and so forth. Pope Francis would have us to believe then all these religions of the world are, and I quote him, seeking or meeting God in different ways. That's what he says of these 9 different religions. They're seeking and meeting God. The same God that he claims to worship, he says these religions are seeking and meeting with, just in different ways. Based on the Pope's syncretistic position, I must insist that the Roman Catholic Church is the immoral idolatress. She's engaging in spiritual harlotry with the religions of the world, and she is seducing the world into embracing the spiritual syncretism of a one-world religion. And it's sad to say that there are many leaders of the Protestant Church who are completely on board with the religious syncretism of Rome. For example, let's consider the content of an article which appeared in Christianity Today back in September of 2015. This article, which is titled, "What Evangelicals Like About Francis." This article includes this excerpt. After visiting the Vatican, Rick Warren was impressed with the humble quality of Francis' ministry and subsequently described him as our new pope. Our new pope? Really, Rick? Why in the world is Rick Warren referring to Pope Francis as our new pope? Not Rome's new pope, but our new pope. Well, the reason for this position is based on the fact that Rick Warren believes, and I quote him, that those who love Jesus are all on the same team. He's saying, hey, the Pope, he's on the same team as every evangelical. He believes that Protestants and Catholics are worshiping the same Jesus. Joel Osteen shared the same sentiment back in 2014 when he attended Mass in St. Peter's Square. Here's what Joel Osteen said about the Pope, and I quote him, "I love the fact that he's made the church more inclusive." Then he went on to praise the Pope for his religious syncretism by declaring, he's not pushing people out, but making the church more inclusive. That resonated with me. Of course it resonates with Joel Osteen. This is the guy that sits on television and can't answer the question, is Jesus the only way to heaven? He refused to answer that question, and the reason why is because he wants to be more inclusive than exclusive. Kenneth Copeland was also invited to meet with Pope Francis at the Vatican City, and then upon his return from Rome, this famous televangelist declares, "I'm so blessed." He goes on to say, what Jesus asked the Father for in John 17:21, that we may all be one in him, is finally coming to pass. Pope Francis is a man filled with the love of Jesus. In other words, Kenneth Copeland believes that the Protestants and the Catholics are worshiping the same Jesus. And now finally, Jesus is bringing us all back together. However, the Jesus of the Roman Catholic Church, I would argue, is another Jesus. I've already made that case by looking at Roman Catholic communion. But another reason why I say this is based on the fact that the theology of the Roman Catholic Church has placed a curse on those who believe that salvation is received by faith and by faith alone. This doctrine, which is explicitly spelled out in the 9th canon of the Council of Trent, it states the following, and I quote it: "If anyone says that the sinner is justified by faith alone, meaning that nothing else is required to cooperate in order to obtain the grace of justification, and that it is not in any way necessary that he be prepared and disposed by the action of his own will, let him be anathema." More simply put, the Roman Catholic Church has placed an eternal curse upon those who insist that the gifts of God's grace and the forgiveness that follows is received by faith and by faith alone. Now, I'm here to tell you that's what the Bible teaches, because that's what Paul taught, that salvation is received by faith and by faith alone. And since Paul taught this, then the Roman Catholic Church has placed a curse on Paul. And the Roman Catholic Church has placed a curse on any person that believes what Paul wrote about salvation being received by faith and by faith alone. In light of this, I would point out that the Pope, he's ready to accept every religious system in the world so long as it's rooted in the belief that we must work our way into heaven. He even told atheists that as long as they're doing good, as long as they're working out good, then we'll meet God together. No, we won't. That's a works-based salvation which will only bring you before God long enough to be judged by him. And yet the Pope is ready to syncretize with anyone who embraces a works-based religion. But those who believe that forgiveness is a free gift, which is received by faith in the finished work of the Lord Jesus Christ, according to the Pope and the Catholic Church, these people are cursed. How backwards is that? That's why it breaks my heart when I see leaders who should know better, leaders like Rick Warren and Joel Osteen and Kenneth Copeland, allowing themselves to be seduced into syncretistic unity with the immoral idolatress who has already placed a curse upon every Protestant. Therefore, these guys, these pastors, these televangelists, those who would side with the Pope, well, they're also leading the Christian church into bed with the great harlot who is seated upon the beast. And listen, the immoral idolatress is not only leading the world into the seduction of religious syncretism, but this immoral idolatress is also leading the world into economic globalism. And with this as our focus, let's make our way back now to Revelation 17, where we find the angel describing the way in which the kings of the earth will eventually turn against the harlot. If you would look with me again, beginning there at verse 16. Here, this angelic messenger helped John to understand that the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot, make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to fulfill his purpose, to be of one mind, and to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. Now, here in these verses, we're presented with more details regarding the relationship which will occur between the 10 horns and the great harlot who is riding this beast. It'll help you to remember that the 10 crowns are the 10 kings who will be appointed by the Antichrist. As a matter of fact, let's back up and look at verse 12. Here we learn that the 10 horns are the 10 kings, or the 10 crowns, which have received no kingdom as yet, but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. Now, based on this, we can see then that the Antichrist is going to establish a global government which is going to be ruled by 10 kings. We went into more detail about this in our study last week. And while I can't tell you how the Antichrist will divide up the world into 10 kingdoms, it is interesting to note that there is a think tank which was formed back in 1968, which is called the Club of, guess what it is? Rome. The Club of Rome. This group of scientists, economists, businessmen, international high civil servants, heads of state, and so on and so forth. They come from 5 different continents, and they've already divided up the world into 10 economic regions in preparation for the reign of one world ruler. Very interesting. What's even more interesting, though, is that it was 1992 when the UN, the United Nations, presented the same global divisions in their action plan, which is titled Agenda 21. Now, based on this, it seems possible that the groundwork for this 10-region division of the world has already been set in motion. It's also interesting to note that this division centers around global economics and the establishment of a cashless society. And that's precisely what John described back in Revelation chapter 13, where we learn that the Antichrist is going to force everyone to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, so that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. In order to put this into more modern terminology, the Antichrist will become a dictator who's going to rule over an economic scenario where everyone has the same basic cashless mark, and you can't buy or sell. You can't engage in a global economy without that mark. And listen, the harlot who is riding this beast, remember the harlot is the false prophet, the beast is the Antichrist. The harlot who is riding this beast will help the Antichrist establish this global economy, which will eventually be divided up and governed by 10 appointed rulers. In light of this, I would direct your attention to the economic globalism that Pope Francis is promoting when he says things like this. Today, we also have to say, thou shalt not, so now he's adding to the 10 Commandments. Today, we also have to say, thou shalt not, to an economy of exclusion and inequality. Such an economy kills. Not only that, but the Pope also attacked capitalism by calling it a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power and in the sacralized workings of the prevailing economic system. Now, just let me say this real quick. I'm not here to weigh in on whether a society should be capitalistic or socialistic, and that's not my point here today. Rather, my point is simply to say that he's attempting to lead the world into an economic, some form of economy which is based on, whatever he thinks is best. He's attempting to guide the world into what I believe to be economic globalism. Now, as we consider the position of Pope Francis, it seems clear to me that he's on his way to helping the world establish this economic globalism. And while the Pope is quick to call for the socialistic redistribution of wealth, I have yet to see him lead by example. He's done little things which have impressed many, but in reality, he really hasn't led by example. He certainly hasn't engaged in the liquidation of Roman Catholic assets in order to redistribute the wealth of the Vatican City. You might not know this, but the Vatican Bank has about $8 billion in assets. I haven't seen any redistribution of that wealth. And the Vatican, which is separate from the Vatican Bank, the Vatican has $1.2 billion, which is just off the records. It's not even on the balance sheet. So in other words, they've got about $1.2 billion in fund money. And I haven't seen that money being redistributed either. And these totals don't even take into account the great wealth of the entire church, the property that they own, the relics that they're in possession of, the paintings that they own, the statues that they own. If you were to take into consideration how much they actually own, you couldn't total it all up. They are very, very wealthy, and yet I see no real attempt for the Roman Catholic Church to liquidate and redistribute all this wealth. Now, as we consider the great wealth of the Roman Catholic Church, I can't help but to consider something that this angel here in our text reveals. It's actually in Revelation chapter 18, which we'll start getting to next week. But it's in the middle of verse 7 where we learn that she glorified herself and lived luxuriously. She glorified herself and lived in luxury. As we consider the way in which the Pope he's ready to redistribute everyone else's wealth, which is, just grade A socialism. Let's redistribute everyone else's wealth, just not mine. He's ready to do this through economic globalism, and yet it seems to me that this could become the basis for the conflict that the angel describes here in our text today. And not only that, but I also believe that a conflict is going to arise as the Antichrist places the Vatican under the authority of this 10-king system. And in order to explain what I'm talking about, let's look again here at Revelation 17, beginning at verse 16. Here we learn that the 10 horns, which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot, make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to fulfill his purpose, to be of one mind and to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. Now, based on these verses, it seems possible to me that the 10 kings who rule over those 10 economic regions of the earth will begin to hate the harlot because of her great greed, because she continues to live in luxury while the wealth of everyone else is being redistributed. I believe that she's going to live in resistance to the global government. I think that Vatican City is probably going to be placed under one of those 10 regions, and that the Pope ultimately is going to be placed under one of those 10 kings. And I think that she's going to have a real issue with this. While it's true that the Pope will help to establish economic globalism of some sort of cashless society, it's also true that there's eventually going to be some sort of catastrophic conflict between the global government of the Antichrist and the Roman Catholic Church, which we'll learn more about this judgment when we get into the next chapter. But for now, we see here that the immoral idolatress is currently leading the world into religious syncretism, and not only that, but the immoral idolatress is also leading the world into economic globalism. Finally, we should consider how the immoral idolatress is leading the world towards political imperialism. With this as our focus, let's continue to make our way here through Revelation chapter 17, where we find this angel describing the way in which the harlot currently reigns over the kings of the earth. If you would look with me again there at verse 18. Here we find this angelic messenger helping John to understand that the woman whom you saw is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. Now, here in this final verse, we're reminded of the fact that the immoral idolatress, who is seated upon many waters or has power over the multitudes of nations, this is also a great city which reigns, or the Greek word could also be translated, has royal power over every other king. Now, there are many who believe that this is referring to the rebuilt city of Babylon. And yet I would direct your attention back to verse 9, where we learn again that the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. And as we examine all of the cities in the world which are situated upon 7 hills, I would argue that Vatican City is the only one which has the royal power over all the other world leaders. As a matter of fact, the political leaders of the world have traveled to the Vatican City for hundreds and hundreds of years in hopes of gaining the approval and the support of the Pope. For example, consider the list of leaders who spent time at the Vatican meeting with Pope Benedict XVI. This list includes President Obama, Russian President Vladimir Putin, Palestinian leader Abbas, Israel's President Katsav. The list goes on to include the President of Sri Lanka, the President of Lebanon, President of Brazil, President of Egypt, Prime Minister of Canada, whatever that means, as well as the British Prime Minister, and so on and so forth. The list goes on and on with all the leaders who have traveled to the Vatican in order to get the approval of Pope Benedict. More recently, political leaders have traveled to the Vatican in order to gain the audience and approval of Pope Francis. Most recently, last May, President Trump made his first trip to meet the Pope, who had no support for President Trump. Not only that, it was last January when the Palestinian president showed up to meet with Pope Francis, and he's also met with Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as Prime Minister of Canada again. I don't know what that means, but I guess Canada has some sort of leadership. I'm joking. I don't have problems with Canada. He's met with leaders of the EU. He's met with leaders of the Arab nations. He's attempted to establish peace in the Middle East. I mean, clearly, world leaders flock to the Vatican City in order to meet with the Pope, and that's been happening for hundreds and hundreds of years. There is no other city with 7 hills that fits this description. And so without debate, the Vatican City is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. And what this also means then is that the Pope, he's one of the most powerful political leaders in the world. As a matter of fact, I would draw your attention to an article which appeared in Forbes magazine back in 2014. The article, which was titled "The World's 50 Greatest Leaders," placed Pope Francis in the number 1 slot. That's right, a secular magazine, Forbes, that deals with economy and all that business-related stuff. They place Pope Francis in the #1 slot of the 50 greatest world leaders. Now, I seriously doubt that the editors of Forbes magazine are thinking, how can we line up this article with Revelation chapter 17? No, that's ridiculous. They're just calling it how they see it. They're not trying to convince us that the Roman Catholic Church is the great harlot. And so it's from a secular point of view that the people who produce Forbes have identified Pope Francis as the greatest leader in the world. And listen, if the Pope is the greatest leader in the world, then I believe it only stands to reason that the Vatican City is the immoral idolatress who is leading the world towards political imperialism so that the world receives the Antichrist as our king. But this is our focus. If you would, let's turn back to Revelation chapter 13, because it's in Revelation 13 where we find John describing the days when the Pope will use his incredible influence to lead people into the political imperialism of the Antichrist kingdom, which is going to result in a one-world government. As a matter of fact, if you would look with me there at Revelation chapter 13, we'll begin reading at verse 11. Here John writes, "Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth. He had 2 horns like a lamb, and spoke like a dragon. And he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. He performs great signs, so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men." And notice, he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. Clearly, the Pope is eventually, the Pope who's here called the false prophet, he's going to eventually lead the entire world to receive the Antichrist as their king and even as their God. And remember, this reference to the false prophet points us to the papal authority of the Roman Catholic Church, whose political authority is rooted in the great city which sits on 7 hills and reigns or has royal power over the kings of the earth. What this means then is that the Pope who is leading the Roman Catholic Church at the time when the rapture occurs, that Pope will engage in political imperialism as he attempts to lead the people who are here on the earth to embrace the kingdom of the Antichrist. Now, as we sum up this study, I want to stress the fact that I have no beef with the Roman Catholic Church. I've got no fight to pick with them, just in the sense that, you know what, if they were teaching the truth, then I would embrace them as brothers. If the leaders of the Roman Catholic Church repented of all of the heresy, if they began to teach that we're saved by faith alone, in the finished work of Jesus Christ alone, I would praise God. But that's not the case today. And please trust me when I tell you that I would love to present you with any other study. If there was another religious entity on the planet today which perfectly lined up with these verses, that's what I would be teaching. But I see no other option. And as we consider all of the details that are presented here in Revelation chapter 17, in my humble opinion, I have to just say that the Roman Catholic Church is the only entity that fits this description, and it fits it perfectly. As we put all the puzzle pieces together, we can see the picture, and the picture is clear. The Roman Catholic Church is the immoral idolatress, and as such, she has been engaging in spiritual seduction for many, many years. Not only that, but I would also argue that the Roman Catholic Church is the immoral idolatress who is currently leading the world into religious syncretism. She is the immoral idolatress who is already leading the world into economic globalism. And finally, she is the immoral idolatress who is leading the world into political imperialism. With that being the case, and in conclusion, I would wrap up by pointing you to something that Paul wrote to young pastor Timothy. It's found in 1 Timothy chapter 4. Here Paul declares, "Now the Spirit expressly says that in latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits, and doctrines of demons, speaking lies in hypocrisy, having their own conscience seared with a hot iron, forbidding to marry, and commanding to abstain from foods like beef on Friday. No, he didn't say beef on Friday, but you know what I'm talking about. They forbid to marry and command to abstain from foods which God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. Listen, Paul here is warning Timothy about these religious harlots who are out in the world seducing people with lies, with doctrines of demons. And we have to get our mind around this, that there are seducing spirits who are attempting to deceive the world with those doctrines of demons. Therefore, we would do well to test every spirit, wouldn't we? Not just believe something because, you know what, mom and dad believed it, or grandma and grandpa, went to this church or that church, or Pastor Bunjee said this or that. Don't take my word for it. Test every spirit. This is precisely the point that John made in the 4th chapter of his first epistle. It's there where he declares, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits, whether they are of God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world." If many false prophets had already gone out into the world when John was writing his first epistle, how many more have gone out since then? How many false prophets do we hear every single day, even on Christian radio and selling their books in Christian bookstores? Or the person sitting in the cubicle next to us at work? How many false prophets are out there presenting us with seductive spirituality, which is based on empty promises? I guarantee that we're surrounded by it. And with that being the case, we must test the spirits. And the way that we test the spirits is to compare what they teach to what the Bible says. We must compare every teaching. And that's my encouragement to you today. Take the things that I've taught in today's study and the last two concerning the Roman Catholic Church. Go test it. Put it to the test. Prove me wrong. If I'm wrong, I would love to correct myself. Put it to the test and see for yourself. Test the spirits to see whether what I'm saying is true or not. And if what I'm saying is true, then I would encourage you to recognize that those who are attending the Roman Catholic Church have been seduced by doctrines of demons. And if that's the case, then we would do well to spend a great deal of our time learning how to reach them and how to lead them away from this harlot so that they can trust in the Jesus who finished the work necessary for our salvation when he died for our sins upon the cross.